Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Hey guys, let's learn. That's what we usually do on this channel. Usually. Usually. Preemptive like, Sarcasmictron. It's been great channels so far. The past two videos I've watched from them. This is a series. I'd recommend you watch the prior videos. Either my reaction to them or just straight from the source from Sarcasmictron. But that's up to you. Let's do it. Shut up about NATO expansion.
By starting this war.
They've been great videos so far. A serious problem in planning against American doctrine is that the Americans do not read their own manuals, nor do they feel any obligation to follow their doctrine. Anonymous Soviet war planner.
So let's cut to the chase here. Why? What did Russia, or at least Putin, think he had to gain by starting this war? It's easy to forget now.
I would assume it would mean Russia sees Ukraine as a potential NATO entry, and Russia, again, the name of the video, title of the video, Shut Up About NATO Expansion. If you're Russia, then you see, Ukraine maybe as the last stand of things that they can acquire through force that is not in NATO yet. And so he's like, hey, either I attack now or NATO will eventually accept Ukraine. That's the best, if I can try to get into Putin's mind, is what he probably thought.
With Putin think he had to gain by starting this war. It's easy to forget now, with Russia struggling to hold on to its marginal gains, that this was supposed to be the easy part. Even if Russia had gotten its 3-day victory in the conventional war, there was always an even bigger quagmire waiting for them there at the finish line. If they installed a friendly government and left, it would immediately be overthrown. If they stayed, they'd have to face an insurgency. And if they tried to just stop at conquering half the country, they'd have to defend a more than 500-mile-long border. So, what was the plan here? I've read a lot of theories, from Putin going after Ukraine's natural gas reserves to a theory that the Kremlin is enthralled to insane philosophers who all talk like Final Fantasy villains.
Every so-called truth is the matter of believing. So, we believe in what...
Sorry. Stay hydrated, guys.
All to insane philosophers who all talk like Final Fantasy villains.
Every so-called truth is the matter of believing. So we believe in what we do, we believe in what we say, and that is the only way to define the truth.
American cable news pundits seem to switch between thinking it's because he's gone COVID isolation crazy or because he's always harbored a secret desire to reunify the USSR. For instance, did you know that Vladimir Putin once
said the collapse of the Soviet Empire was a great tragedy.
Vladimir Putin was the man who described the collapse of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe.
The collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest catastrophe.
The greatest geopolitical tragedy.
As the greatest tragedy of the 20th century.
It's not just a great...
The greatest geopolitical strategy for Moscow power, I would say, is true.
Tragedy, but the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Never mind World War II.
Even Putin can't decide on a single story. One day he's claiming he needs to resolve the imaginary humanitarian crisis in Donetsk, and the next he's writing insane 7,000-word essays on how Ukraine and Russia are spiritually bonded. And what about the Russian people? Why are they going along with this? Theories seem to range from them being completely propagandized to them just all being orcs. And it's hard not to feel like all of these theories leave a lot to be desired, even if you combine them. However, there's one theory I feel compelled to debunk in detail because it is very specific, it's materialist, it's intuitive, and you sound like a rational, big-brain geopolitics understander when you repeat it. and it embodies a whole historical narrative of Russian-American relations that is very popular, even among opponents of Putin's war. This is, of course, the theory that Russia is acting in preemptive self-defense. Self-defense against American aggression, best embodied by America's decision to expand NATO to Eastern Europe, including potentially Ukraine.
In Washington, the foreign ministers of Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, Portugal, and the United States signed with the nations of Western Union the North Atlantic Pact. This was no treaty aimed at aggression, but a pledge to cooperate in defense of the peace.
For those catching up, NATO is a mutual defense pact. If one country is attacked, every other country in NATO is obliged to help defend it. But if one country decides to go out on its own and start a war, the rest of NATO can say, you're on your own. Since the alliance was founded at the start of the Cold War to deter Soviet power creep, expanding it eastward could reasonably be interpreted as an attempt to strangle Russia, at a time when America was supposed to be softening its posture towards Russia. After all, how would America like it if China formed a military alliance with Mexico? But in many ways, the theory that America provoked the war through NATO expansion isn't just about NATO. It's an elaborate narrative of 30 years of American aggression and Russian victimization. There are several lectures.
My problem is that how can you see, maybe if you're Russian, you do see the expansion of NATO as a threat to your own power, sure. But how can you see individual countries who are former Soviet states or former states during the Cold War under Soviet control as not liking you and not liking what you did in control of our countries post-World War II? And you don't think that that's a large possibility of why they want to join NATO so that they don't have to face you again? And you're just twisting that into like American coercion of countries that are forced into NATO because they want to kill Russia. How do you that doesn't.
That have gotten very popular on YouTube that explain this narrative, but the most watched is this one from renowned international relations scholar John Mearsheimer.
The Russians didn't conquer or invade Crimea because they had a leasing agreement. There's a naval base at Sevastopol, and the Russians were leasing that naval base from Ukraine, so they had military forces there.
Mearsheimer has developed a reputation among certain communities as the Cassandra of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and as a result has become an extremely polarizing figure.
Cassandra?
I've linked his lecture and others in the description, but for the sake of brevity, I'll summarize. Allow me to present the great NATO sob story of 1991 to 2014. It's 1990, and Secretary of State Jim Baker has... Oh, no. I can't do voices. We're gonna have to do this normal voice. It's 1990, and U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker and Chairman of the USSR Mikhail Gorbachev are negotiating what to do about Germany. Now that the wall has come down, Gorbachev wants Germany to leave NATO, and America wants Germany to stay in NATO, even after it absorbs East Germany. So in order to get Gorbachev's agreement to let East Germany join NATO, Jim Baker promised America would never expand NATO to any countries to the east of Germany. That should have been the happy end of the story, but America had other plans, because soon after that meeting, America immediately engineered the collapse of the Soviet Union, then forced the newly born country of Russia to destroy its own economy by privatizing too much, or too quickly, or by giving Russia not enough aid money, or by giving Russia too much aid money, or by conditioning the aid too much, or by conditioning the aid not enough, or something. I don't know. It depends on who you ask. Everyone kind of glosses over this point. Then, with Russia crippled, America went back on its word and annexed Poland, Czechia, and Hungary into NATO, and then lied about there ever having been an agreement. Then it refused to let Russia join NATO, proving the open door policy was a lie, and that the expansion was aimed more towards hemming in Russia. Then it
I have seen videos of Putin early on, I think with talks with President Bush, of like, maybe you should join NATO. Russia wouldn't want to join NATO. That would... Whether or not the Soviet Union collapsed, but Russia, that doesn't just go like, oh, now we love the USA and the West, you know? And so regardless of what Putin might have said of like, maybe, I forget what he said, but it wasn't an all out no. I mean, of course you wouldn't do that.
Bomb Serbia for no reason. The expansion was aimed more towards hemming in Russia. Then it bombed Serbia for no reason, tore up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, immediately started building interceptors, then it annexed the Baltic states, putting NATO troops and missiles within spitball range of St. Petersburg, and it was only finally when America was getting ready to finish the job by annexing Georgia and Ukraine that Russia decided it had no choice but to push back and defend itself by invading first Georgia and then Ukraine. But the American empire, drunk on its arrogance and the blood of countless brown people, instead of taking no for an answer, refused to acknowledge Russia's right to defend itself, forcing Russia to escalate.
Keyword, annexed. So countries didn't want to join NATO. America invaded and said, you're joining NATO.
Now, did America say and do those things? Some of it, but, there's a lot of missing context. And, well, it might be easier to go back to the beginning. Let's roll the tape back and start over.
By the time the summit convened this morning, President Bush and Secretary of State Baker had shifted its spotlight.
So, in a meeting, Jim Baker does make an offer to not expand NATO eastward, but it's not clear if he meant within Germany or in Europe as a whole, because before he can discuss it further, President Bush tells him to take the offer back. But for a very convoluted set of reasons, Gorbachev comes away believing that he has an implicit agreement that NATO won't expand. Why didn't Gorbachev push for an explicit agreement? Because he was desperate for cash.
But the Soviet president's biggest headache is surely the economy, deteriorating by the day. Westerners who work in the Soviet Union say it's like living in a third world country. Upper Volta with rockets is the way one put it.
Gorbachev was taking heat from all sides. The leaders of the republics wanted more autonomy. The people wanted an end to empty shelves. And the hardliners in the KGB wanted Gorbachev to focus on holding together the empire. So Gorbachev, to keep his head above water, brought together a team of experts and economists, and they created a plan for a relatively quick but orderly transition from an entirely state-run economy to a mixed market economy. The plan was called the 500 Days Program, and it would keep the Union together, get food back on the shelves, and provide enough autonomy for the republics to be happy without having to dissolve the Soviet Union. But for it to work, the Soviet Union was going to need a lot of aid money. So Gorbachev spent the first half of 1991 going around the West trying to sell the plan. And the answer he got back from the United States was, maybe later. Well, that's fine. Gorbachev would just have to hold on for another year. He was still getting money from the Germans, and with that, he could buy...
Swan Lake.
В связи с невозможностью по состоянию здоровья исполнения Горбачевым Михаилом Сергеевичем своих обязанностей президента СССР.
They first moved in at 4 a.m., the first sign of the coup d'etat that removed Mikhail Gorbachev from power. With tanks in Red Square, the official word from the new government, calling itself the National Emergency Committee, was that the architect of Glasnost and Perestroika was too ill to continue in office.
Mikhail Gorbachev is now on vacation. He is very tired after these many years, and he will need some time to get better.
Tens of thousands filled Leningrad's Palace Square to demonstrate against the coup and cheer their republic leader, Boris Yeltsin.
Перед всем миром, подрывая наш престиж в мировом сообществе, возвращает нас к эпохе холодной войны.
Yeltsin supporters reacted with their bare hands, building makeshift barricades with whatever piece of disused machinery or brickwork was available.
Generally speaking, around the Russian Federation building, people are defying the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew. The people there say that they do not obey the laws of the military junta. They obey only the laws of Russia and the decrees of Boris Yeltsin.
How does a ragtag crowd prepare to fight a division of tanks? They toss a few more bricks on their flimsy barricade, pile up sticks and stones, and post a few more slogans.
The Soviet Union has entered its second night under military rule after a day of growing defiance and rising fears of bloodshed.
There has been now a report in from Reuters, the British news agency, that 3 people were shot dead outside the Russian parliament by Soviet tank crews.
Military convoys were seen heading out of Moscow. tank drivers confirmed the coup was ending. To people manning the barricades here, the first sign the coup was faltering lay in the fact there was no all-out attack on the Russian Federation headquarters. The withdrawal came after dissension had developed in the military. At least 2 crack airborne divisions revealed they had thrown their allegiance to Yeltsin.
Less than 3 days after being placed under house arrest by communist hardliners, the Soviet president is to return to Moscow to retake the reins of government. The fate of the coup plotters remains unknown.
At the end of the rally, the Russian flag was hoisted above the Parliament building in place of the hammer and sickle.
Tens of thousands of people outside Boris Yeltsin's headquarters were elated. In their view, he had saved the day. Victoriously, they waved the Russian flag. And one speaker said, the black night of fear had become a new day of freedom.
It's a thing with communism where, I've said this before, I think communist principles, like going back to Karl Marx, a lot of it was born out of good, noble intentions of trying to level the playing field with people and get rid of the class inequities, right? But the ironic thing is that you don't allow the very people who you're trying to liberate to protest themselves, and then you just seem like the biggest of hypocrites who just want power rather than your true Soviet, communist, socialist ideals.
The attempted coup of August 1991 only lasted 3 days, but that was more than enough to convince Ukraine that it couldn't wait for a compromise anymore. It declared independence 5 days later. But you already know the rest of Ukraine's story. Russia, on the other hand, faced the prospect of a majority Muslim and Asian Soviet Union. So Russia decided to quit the Union too, and refocus on rebuilding its economy under the guidance of its newly sovereign president, Boris Yeltsin.
It is indeed a great honor for me to address the Congress of the great land of freedom as the first ever, over 1,000 years of history of Russia, popularly elected president, as a citizen of the great country which has made its choice in favor of liberty and democracy.
But the now Russian reformers realized they faced a much starker choice. Unlike the other republics, the power ministries of the Russian state, the KGB, the ministers of the heavy industries, and the military-industrial complex were still being run by people either involved with or at least sympathetic to the coup. Yeltsin became convinced that if he wanted to stave off another reactionary putsch, he'd have to disband them, and that the only way to get a market system in place was to do it all at once in order to make it a fait accompli before anyone could stop him, even though this would mean privatizing property before actually having a way of protecting property rights, or ending price controls without controlling the money supply, or restructuring the economy without building a social safety net. In other words, their choice was between destroying the state or going back to the Brezhnev era. So the reformers became revolutionaries, and Russia's experiment in social democracy became an experiment in anarcho-capitalism, with predictable results.
Some prices had jumped even more than the 3, 4, or 5 times they'd expected. This butter was selling for 8 times the price it could have been bought for yesterday.
President Yeltsin emerged as the winner of a bloody power struggle with his opponents in Parliament and their allies on the streets.
Outside the building, bodies still lay where they fell. There was still no official estimate of the number killed inside, though the city medical authorities said nearly 500 had been treated for injuries.
Over the weekend, Russia sent a force of more than 40,000 into the Republic of Chechnya and heading towards the capital of Grozny.
Troops from Russia's Interior Ministry scramble at the sight of an approaching armored personnel carrier. They don't know if it's one of theirs or one of the Chechens. As it passes, they open fire, wildly, still none the wiser who they're firing at.
Starovoytova was gunned down in the hallway of her St. Petersburg apartment in late November. Most Russians regard the killing of this pro-democracy member of parliament as a political murder and as evidence that their country's post-Soviet reform era is ending.
For Russian people, democracy is synonym of criminal anarchy. They never saw democracy as working rule follows the law mechanisms. They don't know what it is.
Panicky Russians tried to withdraw their savings from banks while the country's financial system appeared to teeter on the brink of collapse.
The government virtually defaulted on its debt, and the ruble crashed in August.
Russia has continued to pound villages with their heavy guns, a tactics which the Chechens say has caused numerous civilian casualties.
At times, Russian soldiers have shut down the Ingushetia border.
Sorry, guys. Could I just... my eyes are dry. I've been watching videos too much today. Okay. Sorry.
At times, Russian soldiers have shut down the Ingushetia border and even shot at the fleeing refugees.
Commandos stormed a school in southern Russia today where militants held hundreds of hostages. Russian news accounts said more than 200 people were killed, more than 700 wounded. Many were children.
An inflation crisis, a parliamentary crisis, a street crime crisis, an organized crime crisis, an official corruption crisis, an alcoholism crisis, a banking crisis, a sovereign debt crisis, 2 civil wars, and an Islamist insurgency, all in the span of 10 years. And the KGB hardliners who forced this outcome would spend the next 30 years blaming foreigners and Jews.
Classic.
Meanwhile, in America,
today, a generation raised in the shadows of the Cold War assumes new responsibilities in a world warmed by the sunshine of freedom.
Bill Clinton takes office in 1993. With his 0 years of foreign policy experience on a platform 100% focused on domestic issues, he immediately faces a dilemma. Russia is on fire, and it looks like there's already a 50-50 chance it's a lost cause for the next 20 years. Unless you do something to protect the other countries of Eastern Europe, they might get dragged down with it. But if you make moves on those countries, Russians would interpret it as aggression, and you might accidentally push Russia into the abyss by...
Make moves on those countries sounds like... Is asking other countries if you would like to join NATO in hopes that that will deter possible Russian re-incursion into your nations? Is that annexation? Is that coercing them into it? Or is that just allowing them to join? You know? I understand why a lot of, you know, Soviet Union sympathizers and Russian, Russians seeing that as NATO expansion. But that's NATO expansion through voluntary countries joining NATO. So...
trying to hedge your bets, when being nice to Russia might move it closer to America. And the foreign policy establishment in America seemed to be almost split 50-50 on what to do next. So why did America ultimately decide to take its chances with antagonizing an incredibly unstable Russia? That's where the Agency of Eastern Europe comes in. You will sometimes see people who supported NATO expansion complain that the NATO expansion sob story ignores the fact that
As Czech, I must say that NATO never expanded east. The East joined NATO. Exactly. It was not as if the U.S. were trying to make us join. Our politicians ran to Washington to convince us to allow us to join because we remember the Warsaw Pact, friendly help in '68. Once was enough. Interesting video, very well thought out, but I think it's important to remember that NATO expansion is not something external that just happens to a country. Like what was made in the beginning about the Soviet perspective of annexation, you know? It's like, no, we didn't run in and say, we didn't run in like the Soviets did to countries. A lot of bad stuff. I'm not saying America is free of horrible crap, okay? Excuse me again. But, what was I going to say? But it's like, countries hating being under your thumb in the Cold War era, wanting now to protect themselves from you by joining NATO because they don't want to fall under your totalitarian rule of us anymore, is not military expansion. It's saying, hey, if you would like to join NATO, you can join.
Eastern Europe wanted to join.
As a Czech, we never forget Russia invaded us in 1968, so no, NATO does not betray Russia. We chose NATO in Europe. I love how it's always about Russia allows to happen east. I love how it's all about what Russia allows to happen east of Germany or blaming USA for luring countries in. Hello? We are sovereign countries and we can speak for ourselves, and Russia not being an ally is what happens when they're prone to such behavior. So both can be true. Would the USA and the rest of NATO love for these other countries to join and therefore make the Russians even weaker? I'm sure they'd love that. They did love that. But that doesn't mean that it was annexed. It was, hey, would you like to join? Yes, we would. Russia is like, no, you annexed. That's ridiculous. Let me in.
Saying America expanded NATO basically treats these countries as pawns rather than real people with real aspirations. But that argument's wrong, because even that argument understates Eastern Europe's agency. Countries like Poland didn't get into NATO by just begging until America took pity. Poland blackmailed its way into NATO. In 1994, Bill Clinton's first plan for Eastern Europe was not to expand NATO, but rather to create a NATO holding room called the Partnership for Peace.
This partnership will advance a process of evolution for NATO's formal enlargement. It looks to the day when NATO will take on new members who assume the alliance's full responsibilities. It will create a framework in which former communist states and others not now members of NATO can participate with NATO members in joint military planning, training, exercises, and other efforts.
In the PFP, everyone in Europe could join at once with little fanfare. PFP would allow Eastern Europe and America's military to collaborate, thus helping to facilitate their democratic transition, and it also meant you could do all the prep work for letting countries into NATO without announcing it and hurting Russia's feelings. But for the 3, then 4 countries at the western end of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, this was not good enough. They wanted a security guarantee. They wanted NATO's Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all, and no one wanted it more than Poland. So, the president of Poland invited Boris Yeltsin to a state dinner, got him drunk, and tricked him into signing a letter saying that Russia didn't mind if Poland joined NATO. When that didn't work, Polish officials started implying that without Article 5 protection, Poland would have no choice but to defend itself by pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And when that didn't work, Eastern Europe moved on from the nuclear option and tried the real nuclear option.
Today we're pleased to be introducing the NATO Enlargement Facilitation Act. And we're honored to be joined by a true hero of the Cold War, Lech Walesa.
Poland and Hungary share our Western values, our Western standards, and there is no reason or excuse for the unending delay which the Clinton administration has orchestrated in not implementing this much-needed expansion of NATO for the future security of Europe and the United States. We cannot use the excuse of a Russian election or real or perceived objections of any Russian leader to what is in the best interest of the people of Europe and the United States.
This is, again, something I've mentioned before, is that Russia, you can't, NATO has a lot of rules, okay? But in Central, Eastern, Central, and Western Europe, especially Central Western Europe, what was my point?
Objections of any Russian leader to what used the excuse of a Russian election or real or
right, is that you're not fair, you're playing against someone who is conniving. America and can be conniving, but extremely does not play by the rules, and just the fact that they act like that, man, I complete brain farted.
For the future,
you can't play completely by the rules with a country that doesn't care about rules.
The security of Europe and the United States. We cannot use the excuse of.
So, like, why would Russia not want NATO expansion, right? I really don't think it was because then Russia could be threatened by NATO invasion. I think it's because Russia wanted to resecure their control and influence over Eastern Europe and for former Soviet states or former Soviet occupied states, right? I'd say that's the more likely answer.
a Russian election or real or perceived objections of any Russian leader to what is in the best interest of the people of Europe and the United States. I am confident that a Dole administration will pursue this issue as a high priority.
They started coming to Washington and meeting with Republicans. You have to understand, it wasn't just the names like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel carried a lot of weight internationally. There were also still...
Sorry, my neck hurts so much. I think it's because I'm not, like, correctly facing the camera or the video.
Washington and meeting with Republicans. You have to understand, it wasn't just the names like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel carried a lot of weight internationally. There were also still huge emigre communities from these countries in the United States, and most of them had settled in the swing states of the Midwest. Walesa and Havel, even implying they would campaign for the Republicans, was terrifying, a fear which only got worse after the Democrats were wiped out in the 1994 midterm elections. So Clinton gave in.
While the partnership is not NATO membership, neither is it a permanent holding room. It changes the entire NATO dialogue so that now the question is no longer whether NATO will take on new members, but when and how.
There were good but wrong, reasons to think that Russia would, even with this provocation, still tolerate it and keep moving towards the West, even possibly joining NATO. One reason was China. It was not exactly hard to predict that the main challenge in the decades to come to American hegemony was going to come from the rapidly growing nuclear power with 4 times America's population, and the Chinese government was and is notoriously mercurial. So one outcome America was banking on was that
mercurial. Of a person subject to sudden or unpredictable changes or mood or mind.
Was and is notoriously mercurial. So one outcome America was banking on was that Russia would realize it had more to fear from China than from America, and look to America for protection.
I had one interesting conversation with Zhuganov, is repeated with Levin. They talked about they don't want this NATO expansion, they know it's not in their security interest, and on, and said, well, and if you do that, we may have to look to China. And I couldn't help using the colloquial expression from my state by saying to Zhuganov, lots of luck in your senior year. Good luck. And if that doesn't work, try Iran. I'm serious. I said that to them.
It is so strange seeing Biden. That Biden could have been... Anyways.
And if that doesn't work, try Iran. I'm serious. I said that to them.
But from Russia's point of view, Chinese unpredictability was a reason to never join NATO, because joining NATO would put Russia on the front line of any Chinese-American confrontation. But Russia also constantly gave off mixed signals. In addition to the permission letter Yeltsin gave to Poland, Russia...
But you'd be in NATO under Article 5. I feel like that's a fake excuse.
Russia gave off mixed signals. In addition to the permission letter Yeltsin gave to Poland, Russia could never get its story straight as to what its objections to NATO expansion were. Sometimes they seem to want... It wants
to be a powerhouse like the Soviet Union was again. Is that crazy to assume? Is that it's not about NATO expansion that is going to threaten Russia. Russia has nuclear weapons. It has nuclear deterrence. It's that it wants to take back control of these new Central and Eastern European countries joining NATO, so that if they don't join NATO, then hopefully they can become more under the Russian thumb again. Anyone disagree? Let me know.
NATO get its story straight as to what its objections to NATO expansion were. Sometimes they seem to want NATO in its entirety to be replaced by a militarized OSCE. Sometimes Yeltsin's officials would claim that actually they didn't mind if NATO expanded, but they were worried how nationalists and voters within the country would react. But most often, opponents of NATO expansion
Okay.
would complain that NATO expansion was humiliating.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
And complaining about humiliation was probably the worst way to convince America not to expand NATO, because from America's point of view, humiliation is just an inevitable part of losing your empire. empire.
I wonder if the roles were reversed, and it was America and the capitalist American system that fell, and the Soviets that survived. I wonder if they would think the same way about their further expansion. I really doubt it.
The Dutch had to be humiliated at Surabaya, the British had to be humiliated at Suez, the French had to be humiliated at Oran, and America had to be humiliated in Saigon. But they all got over it. Kind of. Losing your empire is supposed to be humiliating. You did a bad thing, so Russia would get over it. It was hoped.
The Kremlin's public opposition to enlargement, in my view, is largely a question of a psychological problem they are undergoing now, connected with the loss of empire, wounded pride, and most importantly, uncertainty about Russia's place in the world of the 21st century. I
completely agree with Biden there.
And were you in their spot, you would be the same, in my view.
Yep.
I would.
But holy crap, Biden. A well-spoken Biden with an opinion I agree with. I never thought I'd see the day.
Another important bit of context usually gets lost. Clinton didn't just announce the expansion of NATO. He went to Yeltsin and got Yeltsin to agree to let it happen. Because here's the thing about NATO expansion, Russia was actually powerful enough to prevent it. They had demonstrated that in 1992, when Russia ran the same playbook in Moldova that they would play in Ukraine 22 years later.
The president of Moldova today accused Russia of waging an undeclared war against his former Soviet republic.
But wasn't Ukraine already independent from Russia? And you can't get to Moldova from Russia. Moldova's landlocked. You can't get to Moldova unless you go through Ukraine.
He said Russian members of a former Soviet Red Army stationed in Moldova were fighting alongside Slavic separatists against the Moldovan government.
Funding an ethnic separatist war, dividing the country de facto but not de jure, and using the violence to arm twist Moldova into agreeing to never join NATO.
Sorry, so there were still Soviet arms and equipment in Moldova.
And using the violence to arm twist Moldova into agreeing to never join NATO. And even if they hadn't, the Russians still had a lot of leverage in the form of nuclear proliferation. Everyone understood this. They just didn't like saying it. So when Yeltsin started complaining that NATO expansion violated the unwritten agreement from the German reunification deal, publicly the United States said there was no agreement, and it didn't need Russia's permission. While privately, Clinton tried to offer concessions to Yeltsin in order to buy his cooperation. So Clinton gave Yeltsin $4.5 billion in aid, a promise that nuclear weapons wouldn't be deployed in the new member states, an agreement that no major conventional weapons or permanent bases would be deployed in the new member states, and most importantly, an agreement not to announce any of this until the autumn of 1996.
The member states of NATO reiterate that they have no intention, no plan, and no reason to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of new members, nor any need to change any aspect of NATO's nuclear posture.
Most importantly, an agreement not to announce any of this until the autumn of 1996. Why was that so important? Because Russia held its presidential elections in the summer of 1996, and America held its presidential election in November of 1996. So the fall of 96 was the Goldilocks period where it could come soon enough to help Clinton politically, but would do the least damage to Yeltsin politically.
Today, I want to state America's goal. By 1999, NATO's 50th anniversary, and 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first group of countries we invite to join should be full-fledged members of NATO.
But why lie about it? For one, it served the political purposes of both countries. For Clinton, it allowed him to look tough for Republicans, who were rabidly hostile to anything that looked like multilateralism, and it kept America's options open in the future. Also, acknowledging a Russian veto would be a de facto repudiation of the Helsinki Final Act, the treaty saying European countries could choose their own alliances. More importantly, for Yeltsin, it was political cover from the nationalists for taking the deal. You see, he wasn't trading away Poland for campaign cash. He was being steamrolled by America against his best efforts, and it worked.
The more I learn about Clinton and his presidency and his attitude during his presidency, the more I like Clinton. And he wouldn't really be considered a he was a Democrat back then. He'd be considered, I think, more center, but he seems to be very smart and had views and took actions that were very calculated and intelligent. So I wouldn't mind having George Clinton. He was an early American historical figure. A 1990s Bill Clinton as our current president. I feel like it would be pretty okay
for Yeltsin and Clinton, but the relationship between Yeltsin and Clinton was somewhat special. While they personally liked each other, they couldn't really bridge the gap in trust between their respective countries. In their attempts to bring America and Russia closer together, both of them were constantly sabotaged by their legislatures, and both were hounded by accusations that they were selling the country out to the other side. And soon both would be replaced by decidedly more aggressive successors.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
With George Bush, there's less nuance to add.
We spent a lot of time of the people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
I mean, compared to Russia, yeah, but
with George Bush, there's less nuance to add.
We spent a lot of time in our relationship trying to get rid of the Cold War. It's over. It ended.
He did unilaterally tear up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, not even giving Congress, let alone Russia, much of a heads up. He did invade Iraq and convince the world that America was too megalomaniacal to be trusted as world police. He did start building interceptors in Europe. And last but not least, he did push to get Ukraine and Georgia into a NATO membership action plan, against the advice of France, Germany, and several of his own advisors. And instead of offering to trade Russia something for it, he just did it out of the blue.
Here in Bucharest,
I hate the term military police.
World that America was too megalomaniacal to be trusted as world police.
I hate that term. No country should be the world peace. Not America, not any country. No country is trustworthy enough. No country is fully uncorrupt. And giving the title of world police to any nation is just a mistake, because no one nation should be trusted with that amount of power and that title.
He did start building interceptors in action plan. Against the not least, he did push to get Ukraine and Georgia into a NATO membership action plan, against the advice of France, Germany, and several of his own advisors. And instead of offering to trade Russia something for it, he just did it out of the blue.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
And boy, did Russia respond.
It was a war that lasted only 6 days, but which had a profound effect on a country and a region on the edge of Europe.
So, case closed, right? The great NATO sob story is still basically right. If America had just shown more restraint on NATO, Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. And yeah, the NATO sob story does, I think, explain, if not justify, the 2008 invasion of Georgia. But we're talking about Ukraine, not Georgia. And 6 years had passed in between the two wars. And it's those 6 years in which the great NATO sob story goes from sort of having a point to just shameless lying. Because it was in 2008 when wars. And it's those 6 years in which the great NATO sob story goes from sort of having a point to just shameless lying.
Oh, Russia's NATO sob story.
Because it was in 2008 when the great NATO sob story actually gained a lot of fans, both inside and outside the foreign policy establishment. And John Mearsheimer's brand of realism-influenced restraint gained...
In the conflict in Georgia, if the conflict in Georgia... Come on.
Gained a lot of fans, both inside and outside.
If the conflict in Georgia were an Olympic event, the gold medal for brutish stupidity would go to the Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. The silver medal for boneheaded recklessness would go to Georgia's president Mikhail Saakashvili, and the bronze medal for rank short-sightedness would go to the Clinton-Bush administration. I can't read. Clinton and Bush foreign policy teams. Let's start with America. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, I was among the group of Americans led by George Kennan, the father of containment theory. I can't read the rest. Jim Watson, AFP/Getty images. President Bush's bid to win NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia turned out to be a non-starter. Member states opposed admitting the countries to a membership action plan, choosing instead to merely issue a non-binding pledge to admit them someday and review their application again in December.
Policy establishment. And John Mearsheimer's brand of realism-influenced restraint gained a number of admirers. And one of them was now the 44th President of the United States.
In a Cold War in which Muslim-majority countries were too often treated as proxies without regard to their own aspirations.
Okay, I'm not giving points to Russia here, but that's pretty ironic.
I've come here to Cairo,
coming from Mr. Drone Man himself,
to their own aspirations.
And the fact that he's calling the Muslim states,
which Muslim majority countries were too often treated as proxies.
Really? The USA is saying this? I'm not taking away from the fact that Russia does it too, but really? The USA is claiming, is the one saying others are using Middle Eastern Muslim countries as proxies, is rich.
Without regard to their own aspirations.
Oh my God. Jesus Christ, stop talking.
I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning.
Once Barack Obama became president, Russia was allowed back into the G8. A deal was made to move the interceptors out of Europe and move them to boats in the Black Sea. And while the U.S. never publicly renounced letting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, Obama also reiterated that to join, countries needed territorial integrity and a referendum on joining. Georgia didn't have full territorial integrity, and in Ukraine, a majority of the population was against entering NATO.
President Obama. I'm asking why, not as a point, but as a serious question here.
Territorial integrity into NATO, Obama also reiterated that to join, countries needed territorial integrity and a referendum on joining. Georgia didn't have full territorial integrity.
But my problem here is, why should not full territorial integrity keep you away for signing up for NATO? When I understand maybe a little if that territorial integrity is being threatened by, say, the Russians. Wait, are these internal territorial battles, or are they Russian provoked territorial struggles? But if they aren't, if they're internal struggles, then why is that a threat to NATO? There's nothing in NATO that says, I don't think there is, that inter-nation conflicts would mean Article 5, right? I don't think so. And that's just a thing that, is that worth having that rule so countries like Georgia with this situation can't join? If that just gives a heads up to the Russians that, like, hey, they're not, let's just keep funding these places so Georgia can never join under NATO's own rules. I understand NATO's rules are there for a reason, but sometimes I think those reasons might not be worth, the turmoil for those reasons might not be worth the territorial, the strategic ability by Russia to capitalize and take advantage of that stuff. You know, it's like Russia's looking, oh, can't Georgia, so wait, Georgia can't join if they're having internal struggles? Okay, either invade slightly yourself or fund these struggles right away.
And in Ukraine, a majority of the population was against entering NATO.
Well, that's one thing. I mean, if the majority doesn't want to join, then yeah.
Obama talked as if it would need a referendum, it would need reforms before any new countries, I mean, for example, Georgia and Ukraine join NATO. Was this new policy? Was he saying something new here?
Absolutely not. That's been the requirement. Those are requirements for NATO membership since NATO began, and so we're not seeing anything new. That was just a restatement.
But to state it in the way he did, with that audience, what was he trying to do?
I don't want to overinterpret.
The Ukrainians moved on, elected Yanukovych, and agreed to host a Russian military base on Crimea for the next 30 years.
Hey, okay, checkmate. Putin just checkmate your dumbass. Okay, he heard you. Okay, well, put in a puppet. Or sorry, not puppet. Take part of Crimea. Boom. Ukraine can't join NATO. Checkmate.
Locking itself out of NATO until the 2040s. And this rapprochement worked at first. Russia agreed to a massive reduction in strategic nuclear arms, agreed to let American troops travel through Russia to Afghanistan, and put sanctions on Iran to pressure them into nuclear talks. And then the Maidan happened.
Protesters here are fighting back, attempting to defend themselves with fireworks and Molotov cocktails.
And Russia went crazy, killed thousands of innocent people, and scapegoated America for it anyway. And no one in America could see any compelling reason for why it happened. That's why people like Barack Obama and Angela Merkel kept bending over backwards to offer Russia off-ramps. It's not because they liked or respected Russians more than...
See, these are people, Angela Merkel and, Biden, Trump, or just any American president. This is the thing. He doesn't have to follow rules. I'm beating a dead horse here. I know I keep talking about this, but he's scheming. He doesn't have rules to follow. You do have rules to follow, and you're acting like this is a mutual beneficial agreement here. It's like, no, he's playing chess. You're not even playing checkers. You're playing sorry or something. How can you continuously try and make deals to be followed on two parties when one party doesn't care? They only want to play you like a fiddle to get what you want. How do people, world leaders, not understand that?
We're backwards to offer Russia off-ramps.
Oh God, I'm on to 50 minutes already. Jesus Christ, I've been talking too much.
Not because Obama and Angela Merkel kept bending over backwards to offer Russia off-ramps. It's not because they liked or respected Russians more than other Eastern Europeans. It's just that they'd both more or less come to the conclusion that Vladimir Putin had simply made a mistake out of pique and could thus be lured back with the right encouragement. But as we went over in part 2, not only did Putin refuse every off-ramp, he kept escalating throughout 2014 despite already having a practical assurance that...
Yeah, because he's smart and you're stupid.
Ukraine could...
I'm not trying to compliment him. I'm trying to just say he's playing you.
Join NATO. And then, even though America couldn't even be bothered to send Ukraine weapons, Russia decided to escalate the Ukraine conflict further into a second Cold War by attacking the American elections in 2016, a move that completely backfired and led to America sending Ukraine weapons. This is Putin's master tactical plan. The people who...
Well, you could argue that it didn't backfire in hindsight now. Because now you have Trump, who sees Putin as an ally in it. Because Trump, he thinks, the Russia thing was a hoax, and the 2020 election was a scam, was a fraudulent election, and he didn't really lose. And now Trump's back in office, and now you have a president who sees you as a sort of ally against his internal struggle and hatred of the Democratic Party. So actually, it might have not backfired. It might have front-fired.
In 2016, a move that completely backfired and led to America sending Ukraine weapons. This is Putin's master tactical plan. The people who made their name on the great NATO sob story, like John Mearsheimer, just kind of skip this part now. And that's why Washington hates these people. It's not because he's telling them hard truths they don't want to hear. It's because America did what he wanted for 6 years, and when that didn't work, instead of admitting fault, he just furiously rewrote history to blame them so he could pretend he was still right. And that type of careerist historical revisionism would be forgivable if there was nothing at stake but his reputation. But there is substantially more at stake now.
There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage. They're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq? You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these places. In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that.
So, was NATO expansion a bad idea?
Frickin' accuse me?
Forth and so on, establish the Soviet Union.
Now,
there are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen.
Forget about reviving the Soviet Union, okay? Say it plainly. Russia is absolutely bitter about the end of the Soviet Union because it ended their first world power, superpower status. Of course, after that, they're going to want to rebuild some of that power. That doesn't mean they want to go back to the Soviet Union. In a sense, it does. But forget the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell, okay? Russia wants to gain power back. How could he say that? Of course that's the case.
Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians...
No, you're too dumb right now to understand that Putin... I've never...
invaded Afghanistan. You remember what happened when we invaded Afghanistan. You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq. You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon. You want to stay out of these places.
So is he trying to make the point that because of former Russian and American failures and seeing what happens when big powers try to go in and then fail against much weaker powers and it's a giant mess, that therefore Putin knows, like, okay, let's just try and become regular, forget about Russia gaining more power, let's focus on our own military, on our own territory that we have right now, our own borders, and go towards the West and become more like, what are you talking about? What do I know? Let me know. I always want to let you guys know this. I might talk as in a way that I feel more confident that I know what I'm talking about. Sometimes a lot of the time it's not the case. So if I'm wrong, if you disagree, point me out, call me out, as always, in the comments, please.
In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that.
So, was NATO expansion a bad idea? Maybe, probably, yes, it was. At a time when America should have been paying special attention to stabilizing Russian democracy, Bill Clinton corrupted that relationship in order to rush through a policy that didn't need to be rushed to satisfy a special interest voting bloc for an October surprise campaign stunt in an election that he would have won anyway. And everyone in Washington just kind of crossed their fingers and hoped everything would work out, because it was, after all, the end of history. But does NATO's expansion justify Russia's war on Ukraine?
Justify. I'll say a yes and a no. If you are of the belief in Russian government that you need to make sure that before more countries that used to be under your thumb join NATO, that you need to make sure the last one, well, Finland would eventually join, the last one in Ukraine doesn't join NATO. And so if you're of that position, maybe it was the
end of history. But does NATO's expansion justify Russia's war?
Then maybe it is justified. But if you are someone who, Russia is the largest country on earth. You have so much resources. You have many smart people. If you're someone who wants to just move on and just make Russia more rich and more prosperous, then no, it wasn't a justification. But it depends on who you're talking about in power. If you have in power someone who desperately wants to regain more Russian territory and keep people out of NATO, sure, it's justified in that sense. If you're for someone who just wants to make Russia more prosperous, no, it's not justified. And just morally, no, it's not justified. NATO isn't being coerced countries to join NATO. They want to join because they're afraid of you
war in Ukraine. Not in the moral sense, just in a amoral geopolitics sense. No. You see, the point of the NATO sob story isn't really geopolitics. It's about making the case that America is especially evil and duplicitous. And America is not especially duplicitous. America is not anything. Because countries are not actually sentient balls with enduring personality traits.
Duplicitous. Deceitful double dealing. I don't know about that. Crap, where was I?
It's not especially duplicitous. Actually evil and duplicitous. And America is not especially duplicitous.
Compared to Russia, maybe.
America is not anything because countries are not actually sentient balls with enduring personality traits. They're ideas. America can't have a duplicitous foreign policy. It doesn't have a foreign policy at all. Presidents have foreign policies, and there's less continuity between them than people would like to imagine. For instance, when Yeltsin first started complaining about how NATO expansion violated an agreement with James Baker, there was no one in the State Department who had worked for Bush on Russian issues anymore, and the Clinton guys had barely been briefed by their predecessors. So they had to spend a week just tracking down retired German and American officials to ask what Boris Yeltsin was talking about. But the great NATO sob story isn't interesting because it's true or because it's false, but because it illustrates the perennial problem of foreign relations between democracies and autocracies. Autocracies tend to see the chaotic wheeling and dealing of democracies as malicious subterfuge, and democracies tend to think their problems with an autocracy will be solved by the next regime change. And so hurt feelings are almost guaranteed in the Russian-American relationship. But hurt feelings are not the basis of a sound foreign policy. Even if Russia was right to feel entitled to a sphere of influence encompassing all the former Soviet Union, attacking Ukraine wasn't going to reverse the Baltics' entry into NATO. And it didn't prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, because Ukraine wasn't joining NATO in the first place. And even if it was, Russia could have stopped at Crimea. And also, and I cannot believe this needs to be explained to fucking geopolitics experts, Russia has a nuclear deterrent. They do not need land buffers at all. What, is it the 19th century? Are they worried about General Mannheim's zombie army? Do they also need more crossbowmen for their star forts? There's nothing real.
Before I forget, I've already forgotten. God damn it, I was trying to wait to the end. Oh yeah, before I forget, I should have said this long ago in this reaction. I would say to Russia, okay, how about this? You form a military alliance like NATO, and you go to the states in Eastern Europe and ask them to join you. They're probably not going to because they remember Soviet occupation and control, right? So it's like you're mad that you don't have countries that want to join you against the Western powers and American power. Well, maybe that's because they're more afraid of you than of the West. How do you answer that? Make your own NATO. Ask countries in Eastern Europe, hey, would you like to join against Western imperialism? I'm going to guess that they couldn't do that because they hated you and didn't want to do that.
About substituting resentment for actually making sure a war will make your country stronger. Did resentment play a role? Sure, probably. Along with Putin's fear of his domestic opposition, all the weird hyper-nationalist philosophers, and he probably really does believe this goofy spiritual thing about Ukrainians and Russians being one people. But even if you combine all that, there's still a big missing piece. And I think I have found that missing piece. But it is a weird, weird story. Like Thomas Pynchon novel Weird Story. Buckle in.
Great video. I would ask Putin again, why not, instead of invading Ukraine, why not ask Ukraine to join you in a military alliance against NATO? Oh, wait, it's because they hate you and they fear you, rightfully so, from history, recent history, and they wouldn't want to join. Russia is upset, not because NATO is expanding in some sort of annexation manner, annexing manner. It's because they fear you more than the West. Great video, again, by Sarcasmatron. I'm going to watch the next video. This reaction has been 1 hour and 5 minutes on a 36-minute video. Sorry, I had a lot to say. And so I'm assuming I'm going to have like a 2.5-hour reaction to this one. Love y'all. Hope everyone's doing well. Chin up if you're not. Emotions are fickle, my friends. You'll be good soon. I do care about mental health, so I really do hope everyone's doing okay. And if you're not, hang in there. Would love to see any of your comments. I want nothing more than if I said something you disagree with or incorrect, call my ass out in the comments, okay? Any other comments appreciated, answers to my questions. You guys are awesome in the comments. Hopefully I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.